Well, hello there, and welcome to reissue number 3 in this infinite inning side salad of a series. I am Stephen Goldman, as ever, your host. This episode takes us back to episode number 13 from the show's very first year, back in 2017, and it continues a theme from last episode, in that this reprise of 13 is a discussion of the Cozy Dolan-Jimmy O'Connell scandal. Dolan and O'Connell were two New York Giants, Dolan a coach, O'Connell a young outfielder, sprung from the eternal ban list by Commissioner Rob Manfred last week to give cover to his decision to placate the government with his Pete Rose decision. Of all the game-fixing scandals that afflicted the game at the turn of the 1920s, this has to be the dumbest. If you want to add a dimension of tragedy to it, O'Connell was only 23 years old and a prospect who might just have begun to come into his own at the moment that his career was terminated, but I shan't go further with that. I'll let the story tell the story instead of retelling it here. I was just glancing at O'Connell's minor league stats, and my eye just happened to drop onto his fielding line for 1921 when he was with the San Francisco Seals. And under putouts, it says 1,814. And I said, wait, what? Because 400 putouts for an outfielder is a huge number. And thus 1,800 is unthinkable unless you're playing about 500 games a season. The record for left field is Joe Vosmick, 426 in 1932, closely pursued by Rickey Henderson in 1980. For right field, it's a three-way tie between Babe Herman, 1932, Dave Parker, 1977, and Ichiro Suzuki in 2005, each with 381. And in center, it's the great Richie Ashburn with 535 in 1951. Among others, the late Chet Lemon had 509 in 1977, never won a Gold Glove, Chet. I just thought I'd honor him by mentioning that high total. Now, of course, some of those totals for both of them and the other center fielders on the list was their great range. Some was playing behind a fly ball-oriented pitching staff. No outfielder was going to catch that many flies if they were playing behind a rotation of 5 Tommy John clones. And of course, today, there are far too many strikeouts for outfielders to do much of anything beyond read a newspaper, which Casey Stengel once did. Not that anyone reads those much anymore either. Do I sound cranky? Maybe I'm cranky. Anyway, it's not that O'Connell was such a great outfielder, or that the Seals played so many games due to the lengthy Pacific Coast League schedule. I mean, it's California. Why stop? There's no winter. Each of these reissue episodes will contain some new comments by me. It's a great opportunity for me to talk to you more than once a week. And as part of this one, I wanted to frame my opening comments around something that one of the foundational sports writers, Grantland Rice, wrote back in the 1930s. It's a little verse. Granny liked to put some verse in his columns, and he wasn't alone. And honestly, my feeling is, thank goodness that's over. But when it worked, and this was one of the times that it did. And we're left with something that still has some value. I'm bringing this up because in the world outside of the sports bubble, there's been a lot of talk about old Joe Biden being diagnosed with prostate cancer. And God bless him, I hope that he can last a long time despite that diagnosis. The current president has accused him, as always, without evidence, of holding back on that diagnosis, that maybe he knew about it going back to the 2024 election. And this happened simultaneously at a moment when the last election and Biden's decision to run has again become a focus because Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson have a book out which purports to be the inside story of Biden's decision to run again and who was involved in the cover-up. What did they know and when did they know it? And what I want to say today is that baseball teaches us that this very well may be beside the point. I also feel obligated to say that this is 1000% the wrong thing to be focusing on right now because it's a distraction from the fire in the front parlor. It's also going to be weaponized to attack 2026 and 2028 candidates who will be painted as somehow responsible or complicit in this cover-up, this fraud on the American public, which ultimately did not happen. Ultimately, Biden stepped aside. He did it too late to save the election, and so You want tragedy? Here's a fellow who wanted to be president his whole life, who wanted to save the republic and revive the spirit of the New Deal, and he murdered the country instead. Or I should say, he placed the ladder at the bedroom window for the murderer or murderers. That is indeed a tragedy of Shakespearean levels, and one I hope we all get to savor from a safe distance at some point in the future. But as I said, I want to talk about that in terms of baseball. I want to talk about it in terms of Derek Jeter. First, let's dispense with the cancer thing. I was first diagnosed with cancer, ocular melanoma, if you must know, back when I was 32, going on 33. It mostly strikes blue-eyed men in their 50s, and I was neither of those things, but for whatever reason, just a random cell mutation that my immune system didn't catch. It happened. So that Biden, at 83, developed cancer is neither an argument for or against running for president. Yes, he was perhaps more likely to develop it at that age, but it does strike or can strike anyone at any time. So to say, haha, I see, I told you I was so old. I regret to tell you how many children I have seen with surgical patches on their eyes in oncology waiting rooms. I always find that aftercare for my cancer, or at this point preventative care because it's been a while, the prevention part is staying ahead of any possible recurrence or metastatic cancer. I always find it to be physically and emotionally draining. The physical part is it's a long afternoon or morning or what have you at the clinic where I'm poked and prodded in a variety of very uncomfortable ways. But the emotional part is not just sort of the suspense of the doctor saying, as they stare at your inner workings. But the children, it is hard to see a child who is 3, 4, 5, or a baby. I have seen babies. It is very hard to hear the crying because they don't understand what's happening to them. It's heartbreaking that the universe works this way. I got to enjoy 32 largely healthy years prior to that point. Sure, like everyone else, I had my childhood strep throats, I had bronchitis and sinus infections, I had some minor procedures for basically topical things, and the odd health scare even as a young adult because, well, half is I'm paranoid and half is just that things work differently for everyone, and sometimes my body gives off some odd signals. Odd and worrying ones, and the only reason I don't classify myself as a hypochondriac, a chronic hypochondriac, is that I've had a lot of doctors say, no, you're right to be checking that out. That is scary. And unfortunately, a number of times I've been correct in my suspicions, increasingly so as I get older. But again, just being older is not disqualifying. If it were, we'd be living in Logan's Run, if you've seen that picture or read that book, or maybe the episode of the original Star Trek series where you hit like 30 and then everyone gets in some kind of death elevator and disappears. But even if that were the case, it's not like being a child and just coming out of the womb or near to it with some kind of horrible disease that's trying to off you from the moment that you arrive. I know it's not necessary to state something so obvious and upsetting, but the point being, as I said, that cancer can strike at any age and is not inherently a reason that one can anticipate for running or not running for elective office. That said, I do think Biden should not have run again, even before we learned that his mental acuity was kind of in and out. If you listen to him talk, it's pretty clear he's not senescent in the literal meaning of the term. Memory isn't senility, they're different cognitive functions. Still, if you're running against the fellow who was perhaps the most glib, off-the-cuff speaker in history, or presidential history at least, a guy who rarely makes sense but always has access to a gushing spigot of invective, and you can't counterpunch because, one, your memory doesn't allow you quick access to the words. For some reason of age and infirmity, your voice is permanently dropped into a whisper, and you're fighting a lifelong stutter at the same time. You're just going to get slaughtered. And indeed, this happened not just at the infamous debate, but throughout the 4 years of the presidency when Biden was out of view far too much of the time to advocate for his own agenda. And certainly one indicator that has come out repeatedly in the election postmortems is that low information voters had a greater predilection to go against Kamala Harris in the end and vote for the guy who ultimately won because they weren't hearing any evidence from the other side. They were just hearing him over and over and over again. In short, whether Biden was mentally sharp or not was actually, in a sense, beside the point. It's very much to the point of whether you can actually do the job. But in terms of getting the job, or I should say retaining it, he was already too debilitated to make doing that a safe bet. There are whole books on Franklin Delano Roosevelt's decision to run for a fourth term in 1944, exactly 80 years prior to our last election. Just after the Cardinals beat the Browns in the World Series, Americans headed to the polls and reelected the then 62-year-old president at a time that 62 was much older than it is now. FDR lasted only 5 months. It was clear then he was a very sick man, but the question is, in making the decision to run for an unprecedented fourth term, was it clear to him? No one really knows. This was a man who was a polio survivor, which is a debilitating thing in itself, a chain smoker, a regular drinker, and in retrospect, we know he had hypertension that today would send you directly to the ICU. Do not pass go. Do not collect $200. In fact, 200 was a number that his systolic blood pressure sometimes began with. He was in congestive heart failure. He was visibly losing weight. Pictures from 1944 show his suit collars gaping, and he generally looks gray and haggard, something that comes through even when the photographs are black and white. There's also a theory out there that he had cancer in parallel to his cardiovascular problems. If you look at pictures from before his last couple of years on the planet, there's this sketchy mole just above his left eyebrow. Once you know about it, you can't miss it. And then in his final photographs, that mole is gone. And somehow from that, folks have inferred that it was removed, biopsied, and he secretly had metastatic melanoma, which even today is pretty much a death sentence. We don't know the whole story, in part because his primary physician destroyed his notes after the president died. See, even then, there were accusations about a conspiracy of silence around the president's health. Roosevelt's health and age had been a big part of the 1944 campaign. The Republican opposition made it an issue, but FDR, even in a rundown state, was still able to counterpunch, made a lot of jokes about it, and generally was able to minimize it as an issue. At the same time, given what people were seeing, it's hard to say that the Republicans were wrong or unfair to make it an issue. It was a little less hypocritical then than it was in our most recent election, because whereas the fellow who ran against Biden was 78, 79 years old at the time, Governor Dewey of New York, who was running against FDR, was about 42. This is also why Democratic Party hardliners forced Roosevelt to drop the lefty vice president, Henry Wallace, from the ticket in favor of the more conservative Harry Truman. They knew the choice of vice president mattered, and rightly or wrongly, they didn't trust Wallace. So FDR's doctor, knowing all this, having lived through the controversy and the campaign, decided he would make sure no one knew what he knew and then what the president had been told. There are a number of stories, all of which, of course, came out after, including one related by Truman himself, of people meeting with Roosevelt in the last months of his life and coming away thinking, oh no, I was just talking to a dead man. And in many cases, they were people who had known him before or who had at least met him previously and had been impressed by his humor, his vigor, his vitality. Is that a conspiracy if individually a whole lot of people walk into the Oval Office and come out shaken? I don't know that it is, and I also think it's a very big responsibility to take upon oneself individually to say that I am going to be the whistleblower and say that this fellow is in very bad condition. And yet, again, that guy ran a full campaign. That guy was out on the radio in front of the newsreel cameras. It's not like they hit him. He spoke to crowds, often in the ballpark. They'd roll the presidential car in, again, top-down car back in those pre-JFK assassination days. They'd put some microphones wherever he was sitting in that automobile, and he'd speak to the crowd. You were attending Franklin Roosevelt in concert. So in that sense, people did get to make an informed decision. And if you are that self-appointed whistleblower, how do you know that you're right? And how do you weigh working against what you think are the interests of the country by acting to elect the guy from the other party? Is it ethical to say, I'm good with Harry Truman, so I can cast my vote in good conscience because if worse comes to worse, I'm the senator from Missouri. He's all right with me. But let's focus on the actual decision maker, which was Franklin Roosevelt himself. And this goes to Biden as well. Even if Roosevelt had been given a candid diagnosis of his condition, and again, we don't know, maybe he was still in denial. Wouldn't you be? He spent zero time preparing Truman to take over. Not that he was well enough to get a ton of work done in general by that time. That would be part of the denial. Running again would have been denial. He did talk privately about maybe retiring somewhere midway through his term and going home. But see, he still had one great ambition, which was having largely won the war by that point and having cured the Great Depression, in part through the New Deal, but largely through the great government spending program, which was the Second World War. He wanted to shape the post-war world, which he and Truman, following his blueprint, to a large extent did. And now we're tearing that down again, but that's a different story. And so ultimately, no one except Franklin Roosevelt could have taken the keys away from Franklin Roosevelt. He was still immensely popular. The 1944 election was the closest race of his four, but he won. Similarly, Biden, faltering, not senile, was the one who chose to go again. He may have been King Lear, but put the emphasis on king, and not in the sense that the guy who replaced him means it, but in terms of being in charge of his own destiny. Derek Jeter was never a great shortstop, despite 4 Gold Gloves. For most of his career, he hit well enough that it didn't matter as much as it otherwise might have. However, over the last 5 years of his career, when he was cresting 40, and that included one campaign almost totally lost to injury, he hit only .283 with a .340 on-base percentage and a .374 slugging percentage. And at that point, the Yankees were going backwards. And one used to see discussions of moving him to first base or center field, all of which were nonsensical because his bat no longer supported the move. Who needs a first baseman hitting .283, .340, .374? The Yankees did talk to him about changing the way he played, about changing positions, but of course, like Joe DiMaggio refusing to play first base before him, he had too much pride. So fine, he was the King Lear of shortstops, and he had earned that. Fandom was behind him, and he was signed. So how much leverage did the Yankees have? None. His pride should have been the leverage, but it told Jeter to argue, pardon the expression, defensively, rather than to take age as a challenge. King Lear, Act 1, Scene 5, thou shouldst not have been old till thou hadst been wise. Apply that to Jeter or Biden. Take your pick. The joke, though, is that it's not up to us. And so that brings me to Granny Rice and his verse, to any athlete. And again, I've read this twice during the long run of this program, and I hope you won't mind hearing it again. To any athlete, why is it each is the last to find that his legs are gone, that his eyes are bad, that the quicker reflexes have left his mind, that he hasn't the stuff that he one day had, that lost youth mocks and he doesn't see the ghost of the fellow that used to be? How can they slip from the heights so far and never know that the day has gone when their eyes were fixed on a rising star with a firm foundation to stand upon? How can they slip as the comets fall and read no writing upon the wall? Caught by a stride which they used to beat, nailed by a punch that they used to block, trailing the flurry of flying feet, but dreaming still of the peaks that mock. Each is the last to learn from fate that his story is finished and out of date. We know the answer. Why is it each is the last to find? Because no one can tell them, and if they can tell them, then they can't convince them. One more line from Lear. "Oh, sir, you are old. Nature in you stands on the very verge of his confine. You should be ruled and led by some discretion that discerns your state better than you yourself." Have you had an elderly parent or grandparent who would take that advice? Yeah, good luck with that. All right, after a quick break, we'll return to episode 13 for the Dolan O'Donnell story. Thanks to Rob Manfred. They're free! They're free! Curtain rises on an empty stage and you are shocked to see you, yourself, walk in from the wings. You know no lines. You cannot think of a single song to sing. You've never sung a song at all. Panic sweeps over you, but finally, someone whispers, "Say it's episode 13. And, with much gratitude, you do. Maybe we ought to take an improv class. I don't know if I should draw attention to this, but if I sound a little breathless, it's because ever since I started doing this podcast, a rogue grounds crew has taken to congregating beneath my window and attacking every blade of grass with lawnmowers, hedge clippers, and sometimes jackhammers. And so I'm under a lot of pressure to get this in before they return. You may be able to hear them faintly in the distance because they are approaching. It grows louder like a mechanical tide, a clattering ocean of rotating blades throwing off gas fumes. Nonetheless, I will try to get through today's parable in good order. And my topic, kind of unintentionally, relates to the subject of our first segment. So I talked about inviting you to rate the podcast, and I happened to look at iTunes the other day, and we have a very nice pile of them now, all but one very positive. And those of you who left reviews, even the one negative one, I do thank you from the bottom of my heart for listening and spending your time with me. I really do appreciate it. As I said in the opening, this is my way of, among other things, reaching out to the world. But the one negative one, I don't want to dwell on it, but it fascinated me because, among other things, it objected to the fact that many episodes ago, David Roth and I talked about the fact that we're in therapy for various reasons, not just political ones, but that we happened to mention that back in November, the election became a topic of discussion with the therapist. The commenter said, "Way to alienate half your audience." Well, first of all, not half, never half. But fine. The bigger issue to me is that that's where the discussion happened to go. And I'm never going to lie to you. I'm not going to deflect it from a topic just because it might be controversial. And beyond that, if you listen, the discussion took place in the context of enjoying baseball and how can you continue to enjoy the lighter parts of your life when the heavier parts of your life are just very difficult to carry. And I think that's a legitimate subject for a baseball podcast, for any podcast that in a way is about a hobby, is about an entertainment. How can you keep going to the movies when you find larger, potentially life-altering situations to be weighing heavily on you? If I can figure out how to cope with that for myself, or David can, then that's a positive thing for everybody who listens if they can do the same thing. But beyond even that, why would the election upset a person to such a degree that they would seek psychological counseling? It's not just about which side wins. We are all, or most of us, old enough to have seen both sides in every flavor win and do their damnedest to screw things up, whether they're on the left or the right. And that in itself is not alarming. There's a tide and a pendulum nature to these things. No, it's about a specific person and the sense that that person violates societal norms or political norms or processes that have been in place for a long time and have protected us from some of those tides, that renders those tides placid. I think that's legitimately concerning, and at that point, the politics of the person in question are almost beside the point. It's more a concern with the system, and an understanding that if you take something that has evolved boundaries over time and you debauch those boundaries, whether they will ever rebound to the shape that they were in is a question that one might be reasonably pessimistic about, especially if you acknowledge that that old shape, as hidebound as it was, had protective benefits. How do I know that? Why am I talking about this on a baseball podcast? It's because I am a baseball fan, and baseball teaches us these things. Let's talk about something very strange that happened in September 1924 in the National League. That year, the Giants and the Dodgers fought for the pennant down to the very end of the season. These were the Giants managed by John McGraw, of future Hall of Famers like George High Pockets Kelly, of Frankie Frisch, Travis Jackson, Hack Wilson, Ross Youngs, Bill Terry. The entire bloody team, in part thanks to Frisch being on the Veterans Committee, went to the Hall of Fame. The Dodgers were less stacked with those guys, again, because Frisch wasn't there, but they had a lot of great players. They did have 3 Hall of Famers in the spitballer Burley Grimes, the hard-throwing, tattered-sleeved Dazzy Vance, and Zach Weed, who hit .375 that year. Heading into the last weekend of the season, the Giants led the Dodgers by a game and a half, 2 in the loss column. Each team had 2 games remaining. The Giants would play the miserable Phillies, which were a team which was in the midst of about 4 decades of losing 95 to 105 games every year. The Dodgers had 2 against an even more miserable, at least that year, Braves team. It wasn't likely that the Giants would get swept by the Phillies while the Dodgers swept the Braves, but that could have happened, and I guess someone on the Giants was concerned about it. That's the weird part. Before the Giants hosted the Phillies that last Saturday, a second-year bench player on the Giants, a 23-year-old outfielder named Jimmy O'Connell, sidled up to an acquaintance of his, the Phillies shortstop, a guy named John Henry Heine Sand. And in one brief moment, he destroyed his entire career. The conversation that they had was reported in different ways, but it went something like this. O'Connell went up to Sand and said, "How you guys feel about playing these games?" And Sand said something like, "Well, we don't really feel anything. We're the Phillies. We're just playing out the string." And O'Connell said, No. How do you feel about us, the Giants, winning the pennant? And Sand said, "Well, I don't think any of us really care. We just, let the best team win." O'Connell said, No, what would you like? Sand said, "Well, you're a friend of mine, so I'd like to see your team win it, but to be honest, I think it would be neat if we swept you and the Dodgers swept the Braves and there'd be a playoff game." Baseball fans never change. They always root for the most possible chaos, right? O'Connell says, "Well, would $500 change your mind about that? $500 not to bear down on us?" Sand said, "Jimmy, I'm not interested." Now, another version says that he responded a lot more emphatically, like this: "Get away from me. You must be crazy, and don't ever say anything like that again to me or to anyone else." And O'Connell, realizing that he's got the wrong mark, said, "Oh, okay, you go out there and do your best, and look, this doesn't have to go any further than between us. It's just between you and I." The way people like to tell this story, O'Connell was kind of a nobody, but he wasn't. He was a real prospect, and he was just getting into playing in the major leagues. After the 1921 season, one in which the then 20-year-old O'Connell had hit .337 for the San Francisco Seals, the Giants ended a bidding war with the Yankees, buying him for $75,000, which was the highest purchase price for a minor leaguer to that point. They then insured him for a further $75,000 and left him with the Seals for another year, during which he hit .335. If he hadn't played much in the majors to that point, it wasn't for lack of talent, but because the Giants' outfield was stacked with Youngs and Wilson, and also Irish Musial, brother of the Yankees, Bob Musial, who's less well remembered today, but was a career .310 hitter and was kind of a Hunter Pence level player. In 52 games that year, O'Connell had hit .317. That was the career Sand held in his hands as well as his own. The reason that this was such a fraught moment for both players was that 4 years earlier, baseball had established through the resolution of the Black Sox matter that there would be no tolerance for this kind of behavior. And specifically, that Buck Weaver was banned not for throwing the World Series, but for knowing about it, for having guilty knowledge, had a chilling effect on anybody who might even go within 12 feet of betting or bribes or anything of that nature. So you're Heine Sand. Do you say yes? Your opponent? Your fellow power contending for hegemony? Your enemy is asking you to do his bidding, to do something to advance his cause and yours. He'll win, and you will win in a sense, having made $500 that you wouldn't have made as a minor player on the Philadelphia Phillies, a team that didn't really pay people particularly, a team that didn't pay a grounds crew but had sheep eat the grass. It's no small amount of money in 1924. So what do? Do you say, I love it? I'm asking you. Well, Heine Sand says no, but he doesn't turn O'Connell in, not right away. He didn't tell his manager, the former Giant Art Fletcher, but that increasingly troubled him. It troubled him when the Giants won, something neither he nor O'Connell had anything to do with, but he, having just had that conversation, could have been somehow deemed complicit in that loss. But I don't think that's really what it was. I think that he just was disturbed by the wrongness of it. He could have said, I love it. I love making an extra $500. He didn't. What he said was, and this is a quote, I felt guilty all over. I felt guilty in this way that I did not tell Fletcher as soon as it happened, that I should have told him before the game started. But it's the first time that anything like this happened to me, and I just didn't know what to do. So he did go to Fletcher. He woke Fletcher up in the middle of the night and told him his story, and not long into the next day, the matter was in the hands of Judge Landis, who was investigating even before the World Series got started. The tale goes all kinds of weird places after this. It had very long legs. O'Connell tells Landis that yes, he did try to bribe Sand, and that he had been put up to it by a Giants coach, Cozy Dolan, who was widely known as a John McGraw lackey, and that further he had confided in Frisch, Kelly, and Youngs, and that they had all encouraged him to go forth with the bribes. And Dolan, in testifying to Landis, answered virtually every question with, I don't remember. I could read you a transcript of this, and there are probably 100 occasions of Landis saying, did you talk to O'Connell before the game? Dolan says, I don't remember. Okay, well, this happened 3 days ago, Cozy. You don't remember 3 days ago? I don't remember. Wait, you don't remember what happened 3 days ago, or you don't remember that you don't remember? I don't recall. Did you ever talk to anybody about anything? I don't remember. Do you like chocolate? I don't remember. So Landis banned him from baseball. He banned both of them forever. Frisch, Kelly, and Youngs denied involvement, testified reasonably convincingly, and were exonerated. Dolan said that, I don't remember, was just a figure of speech that he used to reply to most everything. It didn't actually mean that he didn't remember. But regardless, neither was reinstated. The following March, O'Connell appeared at the San Francisco Seals Recreation Park and asked permission to work out with the team. He was told to go away. He wound up playing first in an outlaw league with some of the Black Sox, and then ultimately was a laborer on the docks in San Francisco. It was a sad fate, but O'Connell insisting that he was just following orders tends to neuter one's sympathy a bit. My favorite lines in this, and I feel a little uncomfortable reciting them just because he very well may have hatched the plan in a moment of alcoholic insanity, belong to John McGraw, who said, they were dumb. I cannot understand why these two men did what they did when the chances were 100 to 1 that New York would win the pennant. The only explanation I can give is that they are a couple of saps. If you would search the country over, you probably couldn't find two bigger saps. And he added, why should we pay one of the Phillies to lose a ball game? They get paid for losing games all year. And he was right in that sense. Why would anyone, in the aftermath of the Black Sox being banned, want to risk their careers on this? We'll never know. It's been nearly 100 years. It makes no sense. But I'm not concerned overly with O'Connell or Dolan or whoever else was involved in this, but with John Henry Sand, a player of no special merit who had a very short career as a non-hitting, error-prone Philadelphia Phillies shortstop. I tell you about him not because there is a political analogy in this, although there is, but because I want you to think. The other day, I was in the Frick Museum in New York, and there was a painting by Sir Joshua Reynolds on the wall, and seeing his work always brings to mind a line that is very familiar to me because it's one that my grandfather used to recite. Sir Joshua Reynolds said, there is no expedient to which a man will not resort to avoid the true labor of thinking. And that's the value of baseball. It's not just about hits or runs or your tribal colors being attached transiently to the word championship. No, it's about critical thinking. Baseball taught Heine Sand how to think. It taught him, perhaps through a negative example, the banning of the Black Sox and many other players who were subsequently associated with gambling, but nonetheless, It taught him that there were boundaries. I want you to consider, why is it valuable to have those boundaries? Why don't we win at all costs? Why is there terrific power in the words fair play? I don't know if I have time to answer that question in the depth it deserves in the gap I have before the lawnmowers come back. And in a way, I kind of hope you'll do it on your own. Think of all the ways that a virtuous cycle is its own reward. When you know that things are on the up and up, there's a lot of suspicion and paranoia that you can forget, or at least place to one side. That's not a weakness you exploit, but a valuable thing that you protect and defend. John Henry Sand knew that. We should know it too. Well, as Benjamin Franklin once said, cowabunga, we've made it to the end of another podcast. Here we go now with some dated information. The only thing that remains consistent is that we're living in the world that cried wolf. You can follow me at stephengoldman.bsky.social. Not on Twitter, no way. For punishment. As I discussed extensively at the outset of the show, you can write us at infiniteinning@gmail.com. And of course, you can rate us at the podcatcher of your choice, iTunes, or anywhere else that podcasts are collected. I greatly appreciate it. I should also add that should you wish to support the show, and I very much hope you do, please visit patreon.com/theinfiniteinning. Thank you so much. Our theme song, which you have been listening to throughout the episode, and in fact are listening to right now, was composed by myself and Dr. Rick Mooring, whose magnum opus, The Obscene Cab Driver, had better get finished before automated cars render the title an anachronism. Go Ricky. Well, as the old joke goes, as long as I don't put on my shoes backwards and get a bloody nose walking into myself, I'll be back next week. And that brings us to the end, perhaps just a little discordantly, of another reissue. I will indeed be back next week with another story segment from the archives, and of course, whatever new commentary seems appropriate at that time. And as usual, there will be a new episode this weekend. Be well until then, everyone.